if you break an arm, you go to the hospital and they take an x-ray.
Right. Pretty standard.
Yeah. And there's a deep comfort in that process, I think, because it's entirely objective.
Absolutely.
Like the doctor holds up the film, points to that jagged white line splitting bone and says, there is the fracture.
You can't really argue with it.
Exactly. It's a visible, indisputable reality. You don't have to debate the philosophy of the broken bone. You just, put a cast on it.
Yeah, you just fix it.
But what happens when you need an x-ray of the human conscience?
Oh, wow. That's a lot harder.
Right. When the fracture isn't in a bone, but in a person's integrity.
Yeah.
Today, we are opening up a profoundly influential historical text to look at exactly that. What happens when the human mind begins to deceive itself?
It's a fascinating area to explore.
It really is. So, welcome to part 11 of 21. We are officially past the halfway point.
We made it.
We did. Last time we talked with the pioneers. Today we are looking at the course correction.
And we are definitely stepping into a diagnostic landscape that is entirely devoid of clean white lines.
I mean, it's the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Oh, for sure. Because when you attempt to dissect human motivation, especially when it intersects with belief systems, you're dealing with, layers upon layers.
Right. Layers of self-preservation.
Yes. Self-preservation, ego, and just hidden intent.
And the text we're using as our diagnostic tool today, an analytical breakdown of Surah 9, verses 73 through 79 of the Quran, it functions almost like a psychological scalpel.
That's a great way to put it. It's literally designed to cut through those layers and expose the internal mechanisms of hypocrisy.
And the mission here is crucial for you listening. We are not just cataloging ancient history here.
No, not at all.
Or reading a theological textbook.
Yeah.
We're taking the source material and using it to dissect a timeless socio-psychological fact.
Right. What actually happens to a human being or entire society when they start drifting away from a stated system of truth?
Exactly. And how do we balance seemingly contradictory human emotions, like the capacity for profound, soft-hearted mercy alongside the requirement for unyielding, rock-solid harshness?
It's tough balance.
It is. And you will see that elevating certain virtues to an extreme level, even virtues that we universally consider pure and good, like pacifism, might actually be incredibly dangerous.
Yeah. But before we begin that dissection, it is vital to establish our framework for how we handle this source material.
Right, the ground rules.
Exactly. The text we're analyzing today makes some very bold, specific theological arguments.
It pulls no punches.
None. It engages heavily in comparative theology. The author critiques certain historical interpretations of Christianity as well as specific movements within Sufism.
And it contrasts them with what the author presents as the Quranic ideal.
Right. So my role, and our role in this deep dive, is to impartially unpack the fascinating internal logic of the arguments presented in the text.
We are not here to endorse one theology over another.
Absolutely not. Or to validate the text's critique of other traditions. We're just here to understand the anatomy of the argument itself.
And the psychological profiles it constructs. So we keep our analytical hats firmly on.
Always.
Let's get into the anatomy of the argument. The source text begins by analyzing a specific group of people referred to in Surah 9 as the Munafiqeen.
Which translates to the hypocrites.
Right. The text immediately posits that hypocrisy is fundamentally a psychological condition.
Yes, it's rooted in a severe systemic lack of courage.
But it frames this lack of courage against the backdrop of how these individuals interact with the rules of their society, right?
Exactly. The author draws a very sharp distinction between a genuine adherent to a belief system and a hypocrite by looking at the concept of friction.
Friction. Okay, break that down for me.
Well, every belief system, whether it's a global religion or a secular ideology, has foundational routines and rituals.
Sure.
In the context of this specific text, we are talking about practices like fasting, performing daily prayers, or paying the zakat, which is the obligatory charity.
Right, the basics.
Yeah. And the source points out a fascinating behavioral pattern. The hypocrite actually complies with these rituals quite easily.
Wait, really? They actually do the work?
They do. They will stand in the prayer lines. They will fast.
Well, I guess because there's no real cost to doing so,
Yes.
right? Like, performing a ritual in the middle of the community doesn't inherently threaten your life. It actually buys you social capital.
That's it. It makes you look like a team player.
Right.
That is the octative mechanism. You perform a ritual and you remain perfectly safe.
So when does the mask slip?
The text argues that the true test, what the author literally terms the acid test of belief, only occurs when ultimate sacrifice or profound struggle is required.
Oh, okay.
In the historical context of the text, this is referred to as jihad or kilo.
Which is the physical struggle and battle required to defend the truth and protect the innocent from violent oppression.
Right. When that level of existential risk is introduced to the equation, the true nature of the believer is separated from the hypocrite.
But wait, let me push back on this framing for a second.
Sure.
Because if a belief system, or a nation, or a community leader tells you that you have to go risk your life on a battlefield, the natural biological response is terror.
Oh, of course.
Right. Self-preservation is literally baked into our DNA.
Yeah, you'd be crazy not to be afraid.
So where does this text draw the line between a person experiencing normal evolutionary fear and a person engaging in active, diseased hypocrisy?
That's a great question.
Because lacking the courage to die doesn't automatically make someone a villain, does it?
No, it doesn't. And that is the exact tension the source addresses. It requires a really nuanced reading.
Okay.
The text very carefully differentiates between natural, instinctual fear and active, calculated deception.
So the fear itself isn't the problem.
Exactly. It is not a moral failing to feel afraid. The hypocrisy arises entirely in how the individual processes and acts upon that fear. Well, according to the analysis, if a person simply lacked courage and openly admitted it, or if they openly declared their absolute disbelief in the system, they would just be an outright rejecter.
Right. A disbeliever or kafir in the terminology of the text.
Yeah. They would be standing in their truth, however contrary that truth might be to the community.
So the crime isn't the fear. The crime is the masquerade.
Yes. The masquerade is the whole issue. The hypocrite doesn't have the bravery to openly rebel because they are addicted to their societal standing.
They want their cake and to eat it too.
Exactly. They want the physical protection, the economic benefits, and the social currency of being part of the community.
But they absolutely refuse to shoulder the shared burden when a crisis hits.
Right. Instead of owning their fear, they actively invent elaborate excuses.
Like what?
Well, the text says they constantly look for escape routes. They swear false oaths, looking their leaders right in the eye and promising loyalty.
Wow.
All while secretly resenting the system and sometimes actively conspiring against it from the inside.
You know, I'm thinking about this in a modern context. Think about your own workplace or your own social circles.
Oh, yeah.
We all know the modern equivalent of this psychological profile.
Definitely.
It's the colleague who dominates the meetings with talk about core values and team synergy, you know?
Oh, I know the type. Usually when the company is handing out bonuses and the quarters are profitable.
Exactly. But the second there is a massive crisis, like an audit or a systemic failure that requires people to work through the weekend to save the project, suddenly that person vanishes.
Poof, gone.
Gone. Suddenly they have an endless, highly detailed list of excuses why they can't participate, why the failure isn't their fault.
And they leave the entire burden of survival on the sincere members of the team.
Yeah. It's the desire to aggressively consume the fruits of the community's labor without ever risking the calluses required to plant the seeds.
That's a perfect analogy. And the source argues that this behavioral loop, this constant generation of excuses to protect the ego while draining the community, it fundamentally fractures the individual's psychology.
So they're damaging themselves too.
Over time, they rot from the inside out, which poses a massive problem for any leader trying to hold a society together.
Because what do you do with people who are actively, covertly sabotaging the group?
Exactly. And that question brings us to verse 73.
Okay, let's get into the verses.
This is where the text makes a massive, somewhat uncomfortable pivot.
I remember reading this part. It's heavy.
It is. The verse commands the leader, the prophet, in this historical context, to strive against the disbelievers and hypocrites and be harsh upon them.
Be harsh upon them. That command for harshness is a very tough pill to swallow for modern sensibilities.
It really is.
Because we are deeply conditioned to view harshness as a toxic trait.
Right. To understand why this command is issued, we have to do a deep dive into the linguistics of the source material.
Okay, let's look at the words.
The text focuses heavily on the specific Arabic word used for harshness or firmness in this verse. The word is Ghilzah.
Ghilzah.
Yeah. And the author points out that Ghilzah is the exact diametric opposite of another Arabic word, rika.
And what does rika mean?
It means soft-heartedness, tenderness, or a deep, empathetic yielding to others.
Under normal, peaceful circumstances, having rika, having a soft, empathetic heart, is universally praised.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is essentially the pinnacle of emotional maturity in our current cultural narrative.
Right.
We want leaders who are empathetic. We want friends who are tender.
And the text agrees that Rika is a profound virtue.
It does.
Yes, but context dictates the application of virtue.
Right.
In this specific context, when dealing with individuals who are actively deceiving the community, dodging existential responsibility, and endangering the innocent from within.
The text demands the exact opposite.
Exactly. It demands absolute rock-solid firmness. Ghilzah.
So no yielding.
None. The source describes this required posture as being like a rock or like forged steel in the face of deception. You cannot be pliable. You cannot let your natural empathy be weaponized against you by people who are operating entirely in bad faith.
You know, the extraction notes take this linguistic point and use it to launch into a massive philosophical argument about the very attributes of God.
Yes, they do.
The author points out a paradox that exists in the Quran. God is described using diametrically opposed traits.
Right, on the exact same page sometimes.
Yeah. On one hand, you have attributes that invoke ultimate Rika, the most merciful, the most forgiving, the tender, the loving.
Beautiful attributes.
But literally right next to those, you will find attributes that invoke ultimate Ghilzah, the most severe in punishment, the compeller, the unyielding.
It's quite a contrast.
So how does the text reconcile that? If God is the ultimate moral standard, how can the standard be both infinitely merciful and infinitely severe?
Well, to a highly secularized or absolute pacifist mindset, this appears to be a jarring contradiction.
Right.
But the source argues that not only is this not a contradiction, it is the absolute prerequisite for a functional moral universe.
Okay, unpack that for me.
The author extrapolates this by examining the fundamental nature of power and force.
Force as in, like, physical power.
Exactly. We have a modern tendency to label power, especially coercive or physical power, as inherently corrupt or evil.
Right. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely. We treat the capacity for violence or severity as a stain on a person's character.
But the text argues that a sword, which represents physical power and severity, is completely neutral.
A neutral tool.
Yes. It does not have a moral alignment. It is just potential energy.
Makes sense.
If a person draws a sword and uses it to pierce the chest of an innocent person, that is a terrible crime.
Obviously.
It is a manifestation of evil. But, and this is the crux of the philosophical argument, if a person uses that exact same sword, that exact same physical force and unyielding severity to strike the wrist of a tyrant who is in the act of harming an innocent.
That is not an evil act.
No. The source argues it is the highest moral act possible in that specific moment.
It redefines how we view morality entirely.
It really does.
It means power itself is just a tool. The context, the intent, and the application determine its moral weight.
Exactly.
Being soft and tender when a predator is actively attacking your family isn't a virtue.
No, it's a profound moral failure.
Right. It is cowardice, masking itself as peace.
Precisely.
Conversely, being harsh and unyielding when a child makes a minor honest mistake isn't discipline.
It's just cruelty.
Yeah. You have to have access to both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Both the mercy and the severity.
And this framework leads the author of the source text to present a very sharp historical theological critique of how other religious and philosophical traditions have handled the concept of mercy.
Okay, and again, as we navigate this, we are impartially examining the author's historical thesis.
Absolutely, just laying out the argument.
Right. So the source text argues that early Christianity, and it specifically attributes this ideological shift to the teachings of St. Paul, took the concept of mercy and fundamentally isolated it.
Yes. The author claims that St. Paul elevated mercy to be the ultimate and arguably the exclusive divine trait that humanity should attempt to emulate.
Which required a massive shift.
According to the text, it required a rejection of the necessity of religious law and severity, focusing instead on the powerful symbolism of the innocent sacrificial lamb.
And what's the broader consequence of that, according to the source?
The author's broader thesis is that by isolating mercy and entirely rejecting the validity of severity or strict law, this theological posture eventually bled out of the church.
Bleeding out into the secular world.
Right. It heavily influenced what the author terms universal ethics.
Okay, and what does that look like?
Over centuries, this created a global moral paradigm where softness, passivity, and absolute pacifism were exclusively labeled as good, virtuous, or enlightened.
So pacifism became the only acceptable form of goodness.
Exactly. And conversely, any display of harshness, coercive power, or severity was universally labeled as evil, oppressive, or backward.
But the source doesn't just critique external traditions either, does it?
No, it doesn't.
It argues that this hyper-focus on pacifism and passivity infiltrated the Islamic world as well.
It did. It specifically points to certain mystical sects, like some branches of Sufism.
Okay.
The text claims that within these specific groups, extreme self-effacement, total passivity, and absolute poverty became the normalized ideal of piety.
Meaning you were considered holy if you never fought back.
Yes. And the author argues that by teaching people to turn the other cheek to absolutely every transgression, these philosophies left entire societies structurally totally vulnerable to oppressors and tyrants.
Because they wouldn't use the sword to stop the tyrant.
Right. To illustrate the real-world catastrophic danger of this philosophy of absolute pacifism, the source provides a brilliant analogy.
Oh, the story of the villager and the thief.
Yes.
The visual of this is incredible. Okay, so imagine a very strong, highly capable villager.
Okay.
One night, he wakes up in the pitch black and hears the thief actively ransacking his house.
Scary situation.
Very. Now, this villager has the physical strength and the martial capability to easily subdue this thief and protect his property, his livelihood, and his family.
So he could stop him.
Easily. But instead of using his strength, he lies there in bed, staring at the ceiling, doing absolutely nothing.
Yes, listening.
Yeah, he listens to his possessions being carried out the door. He tells himself in his internal monologue that he is practicing mercy.
Wow.
He is choosing not to be violent. He frames his total inaction as a moral high ground. He lets the thief take absolutely everything.
Unbelievable.
And then, the next morning, he sits in the dirt in the center of the village and cries to all his neighbors about his terrible, unjust loss.
And what do the villagers say?
Well, the exasperated villagers ask him, "Why didn't you stop him? You heard him in the house, and you were twice his size."
Right. It makes no sense.
And the man replies, "I was showing him mercy. I didn't want to be harsh."
Yeah, the author uses this absurdity to hammer home a crucial point.
Which is,
When mercy is applied at the wrong time to the wrong person, it completely ceases to be a virtue.
it becomes a vice.
It becomes cowardice draped in religious or ethical language. And worse, it becomes a mechanism that actively enables evil to flourish.
It is such a stark reframing because the source insists that standing up to tyrants with severity, utilizing that rock-solid Ghilzah, is actually the ultimate act of macro-mercy for humanity.
Exactly. Because if you don't stop the wolf when you have the capacity to do so, you aren't actually being merciful to the wolf.
You are just being unspeakably cruel to the sheep.
Well said.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And this systemic imbalance, the danger of elevating one virtue until it destroys the others, brings us to one of the most fascinating linguistic deep dives in the source material.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
The text explores the concept of ilhad.
Right. In modern conversational Arabic, ilhad is most commonly translated simply as atheism, heresy, or a severe deviation from the truth.
Just a general term for deviating.
Yes. But to understand why the Quran utilizes this specific word to describe ideological failure, the author takes us back to its physical linguistic root.
And the root is connected to a very specific physical object, isn't it? It has to do with burial practices.
Correct. The root of ilhad is intrinsically linked to the word lad.
Lad, okay.
In traditional burial practices in the Arabian Peninsula, a lad is a specific type of grave.
How is it different from a normal grave?
Well, you don't just dig a hole straight down into the earth and place the body at the bottom. A lad is a grave where you dig down, and then at the bottom you dig a niche or a cavity leaning entirely off to one side.
Deeply into the lateral wall of the grave.
Exactly. And the body is placed in that side niche.
Okay, I see.
Therefore, the linguistic essence of the word ilhad does not just mean denial. It essentially means leaning entirely to one extreme.
Deviating off the central vertical path and getting permanently stuck in a side pocket.
Yes.
Okay, so if the literal definition is a sideways grave, how does the text connect that to a person's belief system or their morality?
Well, the source text argues that true ilhad, true catastrophic deviation, isn't necessarily just about looking at the sky and denying that God exists.
It's more subtle than that.
Much more subtle. It can, and often does, happen when a belief system takes one single divine attribute like mercy or like severity and obsesses over it.
Ah, so you lean entirely into that one trait.
Yes, the ideology elevates that single trait while completely abandoning its counterbalance.
So if you focus entirely on mercy and abandon justice.
You have committed ilhad. You have leaned entirely into one extreme and imbalanced the entire system, rendering it non-functional.
Wow.
The Quranic ideal, the author states, is to call upon all the beautiful names, all the attributes of God in a state of perfect, dynamic balance.
So it is about having the profound wisdom to apply the exact right attribute to the exact right situation.
Exactly.
The source material sparks an analogy here that I think crystallizes this perfectly.
Oh, let's hear it.
Imagine you have a beautifully crafted, highly expensive toolbox. Inside, you have hammers, precision screwdrivers, heavy wrenches, and surgical scalpels.
A tool for every job.
Right. But you decide, for whatever philosophical or ideological reason, that the hammer is the most virtuous tool.
The holy tool.
Yeah, the holy tool, the pacifist tool, whatever you want to call it. So you mandate that you will use the hammer for absolutely everything.
That's not going to end well.
No. I mean, you use it to drive nails into a plank,
Yeah.
and it works flawlessly. You feel validated.
Here's her.
But then you try to use that same hammer to fix a delicate Swiss watch.
Oh, no.
Or worse, you try to use the hammer to perform open-heart surgery.
You are going to cause absolute devastation.
Right. And the tragic irony is the destruction isn't because the hammer is evil. The destruction happens because you committed ilhad with your tools.
You leaned entirely onto one instrument.
Exactly. You applied the wrong moral tool to a situation that required a scalpel.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the author's core argument.
It really makes it clear.
It does.
Yeah.
But philosophical arguments about toolboxes and divine attributes can remain very abstract.
True.
To ground these concepts in human reality, the source provides 4 specific historical case studies from the early Islamic period.
Let's walk through these, because they challenge everything we think we know about emotional regulation.
They really do. They're
Yeah.
not just passing anecdotes, they are intended to serve as historical blueprints.
Showing what this perfect emotional and moral balance looks like when manifested in a human being.
Exactly. So the first story centers on the Prophet himself, detailing an intense moment where he had to balance deep empathy with unshakable justice.
Okay, set the scene for us.
The source text recounts a historically documented moment where the Prophet is overseeing the execution of a criminal.
Okay.
This individual had committed a severe crime against the society, and the legal framework demanded capital punishment.
A heavy burden for any leader.
Very. And as the execution is about to proceed, the criminal's young daughter rushes forward through the crowd. She throws herself at the Prophet, clinging to his legs, weeping hysterically, and begging him to spare her father's wife.
If you are a leader, the pressure in that moment is unimaginable. Everyone is watching you. The child is wailing.
Yeah.
And the text points out that the Prophet doesn't just stand there like a stoic, unfeeling statue. He doesn't look down at her with cold indifference. He reacts profoundly.
He weeps openly.
He does.
The text emphasizes that his eyes filled with tears, and he wept out of deep, genuine empathy for the sheer agony of this young girl.
So his heart was soft. He felt the absolute maximum capacity of Rika.
He was not immune to her pain.
Right.
Yet, despite his own profound emotional distress and deep empathy, he still ordered the execution to proceed according to the law.
That cognitive dissonance, the ability to cry for the child while ordering the death of the father, is incredibly difficult to reconcile for a lot of people.
It is.
We tend to think that if you truly feel empathy, you will alter the rules to soothe the pain.
And that is exactly the assumption the author is trying to dismantle. The author uses this specific narrative to define true, rigorous emotional intelligence.
Okay.
The Prophet had the emotional capacity to feel absolute, genuine mercy for the child. But he combined that internal empathy with the external, unshakable fortitude the Ghilzah required to uphold justice for the broader society. The text implicitly asks the reader, if he had let the criminal go just to stop the child from crying, what would he actually be doing?
He would be prioritizing his personal emotional comfort over the safety and justice required for the entire community.
Precisely. He held both extremes perfectly in balance, the scalpel and the hammer.
It is a stunning display of internal control.
It really is.
Let's move to the second and third stories because they focus on Umar, the second caliph.
Right, Umar.
Umar is historically famous for being a very formidable, strict, and physically imposing leader. He was the embodiment of Ghilzah.
Oh, absolutely.
And the second story in our source text is essentially about an ancient job interview.
Yes. Umar is in the process of appointing a man to be a high-ranking provincial governor.
Which is a position that requires immense administrative authority.
Definitely. During their conversation, a young child comes into the room. Historical accounts suggest it was likely Umar's own child or grandchild.
Okay.
Umar interrupts the meeting to pick up the child, kiss them, and hug them warmly.
Very natural reaction.
Right. But the man being interviewed watches this, scoffs a bit, and brags, "I have 10 children, and I have never kissed or hugged a single one of them."
He thinks he is projecting strength.
He does.
He thinks he is showing Umar, this famously tough caliph, that he is a stoic, unshakable military man.
Exactly. He misreads the room entirely.
What does Umar do?
Umar's reaction is instantaneous. He immediately dismisses the man and permanently revokes the appointment.
Just like that.
Just like that. Umar's logic, which the source presents as an airtight psychological assessment, is this. If you fundamentally lack the capacity for natural mercy and softness for your own flesh and blood, you absolutely cannot be trusted to govern the public with empathy. A heart that is permanently hard, that is committed ilhad towards severity, is just as dangerous as a heart that is permanently soft.
But the text immediately juxtaposes that with a third story, also about Umar, which shows the absolute inverse of that exact scenario.
Indeed. Later in Umar's life, one of his own sons commits a severe crime.
Oh, this is the story about his son.
Yes, a crime that, under the established legal code, requires a harsh public corporal punishment.
Okay, adding immense complication to this, Umar's son was genuinely physically ill at the time.
He was.
Other officials, advisors, and family members surrounded Umar, begging him to find a loophole.
Because of course they did. It's his son.
They pleaded with him to either pardon his son entirely or at the very least administer the punishment secretly inside the walls of the house.
To spare the family the brutal public shame.
And to protect the sick young man from public humiliation.
Right.
If there was ever a time to lean on Rika, to use your power to show mercy, this is it. It's your sick son.
But Umar refuses entirely. He orders his son to be brought out and publicly punished according to the exact letter of the law.
No exceptions.
With the exact same severity as any ordinary citizen with no political connections would experience.
Wow.
The source notes that the son eventually died.
Oh, that's tragic.
It is. And while historical accounts debate whether the death was directly from the punishment or the underlying illness, the author's point remains pristine.
Which is?
Umar did not allow his profound, proven love as a father to corrupt his duty as the executor of justice. He did not grant a corrupt, nepotistic exception for his own blood.
It is the ultimate display of prioritizing the integrity of the system over intense personal attachment.
Exactly.
It proves his Ghilzah wasn't malice, it was a commitment to principle.
Right.
And that sets the stage for the final historical case study the source provides, which is arguably one of the most famous events in history, the conquest of Mecca.
This event represents the ultimate synthesis of the author's argument regarding the balance of power and mercy.
The context is crucial here.
It is. For over a decade, the Prophet and his early followers were brutally persecuted, economically starved, tortured, and murdered by the ruling leadership of Mecca.
They were driven from their homes as refugees.
Yes. Eventually, after years of conflict, the balance of power shifts dramatically.
The Prophet returns to Mecca, leading an overwhelming, unopposed army. He conquers the city.
He does.
He now holds absolute, undisputed, physical and legal power over the very individuals who murdered his family and his closest companions.
If we look at historical precedent, he has the power, the legal justification, and the expected mandate to enact the most severe punishment imaginable.
Every other conquering army in human history would have razed the city to the ground.
They would have executed the political leadership and enslaved the populace.
And the text implies that is exactly what the Meccans expected.
They knew what they had done, and they expected the sword.
But instead, standing at the absolute zenith of his power, fully capable of manifesting ultimate severity without anyone questioning him.
He chooses absolute forgiveness.
It's incredible.
He grants a sweeping general amnesty. He tells them to go free.
How does the text analyze that decision in light of everything we've discussed about not letting the thief rob the house? Why is this not cowardice?
Because the application of mercy here was not born out of a lack of power or a fear of conflict.
Well,
It was born out of absolute supremacy.
that's the difference.
The source uses this to demonstrate that true emotional intelligence, true morality, isn't about defaulting to being nice because you were too weak to be anything else.
Oh, that's profound.
It is about having access to your full spectrum of capabilities.
Hmm.
You have the total capacity to destroy your enemy, but you use your intellect to recognize that the socio-psychological moment requires mercy to heal the society.
Right.
You have the capacity to weep for a criminal's child, but your intellect decides the moment requires justice to protect the future.
You are not a slave to a single emotion.
Exactly. You are consciously driving the vehicle of your own psychology rather than letting your blind impulses drag you behind them.
Which provides a brilliant, sharp transition back to the text's core subject, the hypocrites.
Yes, let's bring it back to them.
Because the source argues that the hypocrite is someone who has completely, fundamentally lost control of that internal vehicle.
Right. Moving into verses 74 through 77 of Surah 9, the text describes a specific, tragic, psychological spiral.
Walk us through it.
The source outlines a scenario where individuals make a desperate, conditional promise to the divine. They say, if you grant me wealth, if you just give me this one big financial break, I will be charitable. I will help the poor. I will be a righteous person.
We've all made those kinds of bargains, right?
Yeah, it's a deeply transactional promise born out of a moment of restriction or desperation.
But the text acutely observes what happens when that wealth is actually granted.
Right. Once the pressure is off, once their pockets are full and their status is elevated, the memory of that desperate promise evaporates.
They hoard the wealth.
They turn away from the community. And the text makes a chilling psychological diagnosis here.
What's the diagnosis?
As a direct result of this broken promise, this conscious betrayal of their own stated values, hypocrisy is permanently installed in their hearts.
Installed, like a program.
Yes.
You know, the extraction notes point out a dynamic here that is incredibly profound. Think about the mechanics of starting a car engine.
Okay.
When you get in a car and turn the key, you are engaging the starter motor, which draws a massive spike of electricity from the battery.
It takes effort.
Exactly. It takes a conscious, deliberate, forceful spark of energy to get the pistons moving.
Right.
But once the engine actually catches, once that internal combustion process begins, you let go of the key.
And it runs on its own.
The engine is no longer relying on the starter. It is running entirely on its own momentum. It fuels itself, stroke after stroke.
That is such a good analogy. The source text applies that exact mechanical logic to self-deception.
How does that work in the mind?
Well, humans usually deceive themselves consciously at the very beginning.
Yeah.
You know you are making an excuse. You know you are breaking a promise you made to yourself or to God.
You are actively turning the key of the lie.
Yes. But if you do it enough times, the source argues, that hypocrisy begins to run on an unconscious momentum.
Wow.
It becomes your default neurological operating system. The tragedy of verses 74 through 77 is that these individuals literally lose the cognitive ability to realize that they are lying to themselves.
They start implicitly believing their own elaborate excuses.
Exactly.
And this leads to one of the most mind-bending philosophical points in the entire deep dive today.
Let's hear it.
You pointed out a specific verse discussed in the source where the hypocrites come to the prophet and say, "We bear witness that you are the messenger of God."
Right.
Now, factually, from the perspective of the text and the believers, that statement is 100% empirically true. He is the messenger.
Unquestionably.
But the verse immediately follows up their statement by saying, God bears witness that the hypocrites are liars.
Right.
Wait, if I say the sky is blue, but I secretly hate this guy, I'm not lying about the sky being blue.
Yeah.
How does the text justify calling a factually accurate statement a lie?
It's a great question. And it forces us to define the mechanics of truth within this specific theological framework.
Okay, define it for me.
How can they be liars if the words vibrating in the air are factually correct?
Exactly.
The source unpacks this by asserting that truth is not merely about the objective reality of the words spoken. Truth requires the absolute alignment between the tongue and the heart.
Tongue in the heart.
Yes. The hypocrites are stating a fact, but their intent is deceptive, and their heart actively disbelieves what their tongue is articulating.
So they are saying it just to gain political favor.
Or to dodge suspicion. Therefore, even when they speak an objective truth, they are engaging in the act of lying.
Wow.
For a statement to be truly honest in this paradigm, your internal reality must be in perfect, resonant sync with your external expression.
That is a heavy, heavy metric for honesty.
It is.
It means you can't just hide behind technicalities. You can't say, well, technically I didn't lie, if your entire intent in the conversation was manipulation.
Nope, you can't game the system.
And This diseased internal reality, this engine of self-deception running on its own momentum, eventually has to manifest in how they treat the people around them.
It absolutely does. Which brings us to the final verse in our exploration today, verse 79.
Here, the mask slips entirely.
It does. Verse 79 describes a scenario that exposes the absolute bottom of the hypocrite's psychological descent.
What happens?
The text describes a moment where the community is gathering funds for a critical existential cause, perhaps defense or survival.
High stakes.
Very. When wealthy, sincere believers come forward and give massive sums of money, the hypocrites stand on the sidelines and actively mock them.
Mocking people giving charity.
Yes. Whispering things like, oh, they're just showing off. They just want the prestige. It's all performative.
Okay, so they attack the rich.
But then, when poor believers come forward, people who have almost nothing to their name, and they give whatever tiny, meager amount they manage to scrape together by skipping meals.
The hypocrites mock them too.
They do. They point and say, what is that handful of dates going to do? God doesn't need your useless little contribution.
Why do they care? Why do they feel the compulsion to mock both ends of the spectrum?
The author of the source text unpacks the psychological root of this behavior, labeling it a deeply diseased mentality.
Diseased mentality.
Yes. The hypocrite at this terminal stage is entirely consumed by intense toxic envy.
Envy.
Envy, because they themselves fundamentally lack the natural inclination, the courage, and the sincerity to do good. It physically pains them to witness it in others.
So it's an elaborate ego defense mechanism.
Precisely. To protect their own fragile ego, to justify their own systemic inaction and cowardice, they have to tear down the virtue of everyone around them.
That makes so much sense.
If they can convince themselves and others that the rich guy is just an arrogant show-off and the poor guy is just a delusional idiot,
then their own decision to sit on the sidelines and do absolutely nothing feels intellectually justified.
exactly, they don't have to feel the sting of guilt if everyone else is just faking it.
The source introduces an analogy here involving a date palm tree that I think perfectly captures the difference between the sincere believer and the hypocrite.
It's a beautiful analogy.
The author compares sincere obedience to a higher moral principle, to a fully ripe date on a palm branch.
Okay.
When the fruit is perfectly ripe, you don't have to yank it off the branch. You barely have to touch it.
It just comes off.
It just falls from the tree naturally, without force, almost as if it is surrendering to gravity.
Because it's ready.
Exactly. It is an effortless action because it is the natural, organic culmination of the tree's growth process over time.
Right.
The sincere believer does good because it is the natural output of their internal state.
Mm.
But the hypocrites lack this natural surrender.
Nothing they do is organic.
Nothing. Every single good deed they perform, every ritual they attend, has to be forced, calculated, and highly transactional.
Right. They are violently yanking unripe, bitter fruit off the branch.
Just to put it in a display basket so the community can see it.
It's a tragic state of being. And the source ends this entire section with a very grim, definitive warning regarding this behavior.
Let's hear the warning.
The consequence outlined in the text is severe and poetic in its justice. Because the hypocrites dedicate their energy and their lives to mocking the sincere efforts of others, the text states that God mocks them in return.
God mocks them.
Yes. The ultimate reality they're promised is an agonizing one because they have spent their entire existence building a fragile fortress of lies and rationalizations.
That will eventually, inevitably, collapse in on them.
Leaving them with nothing but the reality of their own cowardice.
Wow. Okay, let's take a deep breath and synthesize the massive amount of ground we've covered today.
It was a lot.
It really was. We started by looking at the X-ray of the human heart, defining a hypocrite not just as a bad person, but as someone crippled by a lack of courage.
Someone who desperately wants the benefits and safety of a society without ever being willing to share in the sacrifice when the acid test arrives.
Right. We explored the vital, necessary balance between soft-hearted mercy Rika and unyielding harshness Ghilzah.
And we recognize the philosophical argument that power is entirely neutral and that context dictates morality.
We analyzed the historical dangers of extreme, unbalanced pacifism. You know, the villager who lets the thief rob his house and deludes himself into calling it virtue.
We dove into the linguistics of ilhad, the very real danger of leaning so far into one extreme virtue that you capsize your entire moral boat.
We saw how historical figures balanced deep, genuine tears of empathy with the iron, unshakable will of justice.
We mapped out the tragic car engine of self-deception, exploring how a conscious lie eventually turns into an unconscious momentum.
And finally, we looked at the toxic, diseased nature of envy, how a broken ego forces people to mock the sincerity they themselves lack.
It is a profound, unsparing psychological profile that forces any honest reader to examine the deepest, most hidden motivations driving their own behavior.
And that is exactly where I want to leave you today.
Some homework for the listeners.
Always. I want you to think about the virtues you pride yourself on. Think about the times you chose not to act, not to speak up, not to fight back against something you knew was wrong.
Tough questions.
Is your mercy and your forgiveness truly a deliberate moral choice made from a position of capability and strength?
Or is it just a disguised form of cowardice?
Exactly. Are you calling yourself a pacifist or a peacemaker just because you are secretly terrified of conflict?
Are you driving the vehicle of your life with deliberate, honest intention?
Or are you just running on the unconscious momentum of your own decades-old excuses?
It is a lot to think about.
It is. And the journey into this incredible historical and psychological text is far from over. Next time, we will be looking at what happens when you finally realize you've drifted off course.
How do you stop the engine?
How do you find your way back to the truth? We'll be exploring the deep, mechanical meaning of Tawbah and looking at the socio-psychological reality of what happens when the world suddenly feels very, very narrow.
Can't wait for that one.
It's going to be great. We'll see you for part 12. Until then, keep looking at those murky waters, and don't be afraid of what you might find.